I knew my HOA president, Karren Stockton, had a personal vendetta against me, but I never expected her to take it this far. It all started when I refused to pay a ridiculous fine she tried to slap on me for having my truck parked in my own driveway. According to her, it was an eyesore and a violation of community aesthetics. I pointed out that the HOA rules didn't ban personal trucks, just commercial ones, and mine had no company logos or equipment in sight. But Karren wasn't interested in logic, she was interested in control. When I ignored her bogus fine, she started escalating. First, random complaints about my lawn being too unkempt, even though I mowed it weekly. Then letters about my porch light being too bright, despite being the same wattage as everyone else's. I figured she'd eventually get bored and move on to harassing someone else. I was wrong. One evening, I came home from work to find my front gate chained shut, thick metal chains wrapped around both sides with a heavy-duty padlock securing them. A bright red HOA violation notice was taped to the gate, claiming my property was non-compliant and had been secured until further notice. I stood there, gripping the notice in disbelief. She had locked me out of my own home. I glanced around the neighborhood. A few people peeked through their windows, pretending not to see. Nobody wanted to get on Karren's bad side. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I walked around the side of my property, hopped the fence, and went straight to my tool shed. If Karren thought a few chains were going to stop me, she was sorely mistaken. I grabbed my bolt cutters, marched back to the gate, and snapped the padlock in 2 clean cuts. The chains clattered to the ground. I picked them up, turned them over in my hands, and chuckled to myself. If Karren wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. I had a plan, and it was going to hit her where it hurt the most. The broken chain lay at my feet, a symbol of the battle line Karren had drawn. But she had no idea just how far I was willing to go. I tossed the severed links into a trash bin and walked inside, already forming my plan. Karren thrived on intimidation, using fines and petty rules to keep the neighborhood under her thumb. But she had just crossed into outright illegal territory. If she thought I would let that slide, she was about to get the shock of her life literally. I spent the next hour digging through property records and HOA bylaws, looking for the perfect way to push back. That's when I found something that made me laugh out loud. The HOA's electrical grid was tied into a community maintenance panel located of all places on my property. Years ago, before I moved in, this land had been part of an old utility lot. When the neighborhood was developed, the HOA negotiated to keep the panel there, but the deed still listed it as being under my ownership. In short, I had the legal right to shut off the power to any non-essential HOA functions, including Karren's house, since she had opted into the community's shared electrical plan. I didn't even hesitate. The next morning, I walked outside with a coffee in one hand and a wrench in the other. I casually made my way to the maintenance panel, checking over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching too closely. Not that I was doing anything illegal, I had every right to access my own property. With a few turns of the wrench, I disconnected Karren's house from the shared power grid. The moment I flipped the final switch, I heard a distant, muffled shout from her direction. I strolled back up to my porch, taking my time as I settled into a chair and waited. It didn't take long. Karren stormed out of her house in a frenzy, her hair still in curlers, waving her phone in the air as if she could intimidate the power back on. She spun around, her eyes darting across the street until they landed on me. Her face twisted in rage, and she marched straight over, her heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "My power just went out," she snapped. "Did you have something to do with this?" I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "That's funny," I said. "You're standing on my property, demanding answers, after you chained my gate shut last night. I don't remember you being too concerned about property rights then." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she wasn't backing down. "That was an enforcement action," she said. "You were in violation of HOA policies." I cut her off with a laugh. "You mean the same policies that don't give you the authority to seize someone's home? Or maybe you're talking about the ones that say tampering with private property is a criminal offense." I leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "Because I've already spoken to a lawyer, Karren, and I have more than enough evidence to press charges for trespassing and illegal lockout." For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker in her expression. She wasn't used to people pushing back, and she definitely wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. "You wouldn't dare," she said, her voice less certain than before. I smiled. "Try me." She stared at me, her nostrils flaring as she weighed her options. Then, In a desperate attempt to regain control, she changed tactics. "You need to restore my power immediately," she demanded. "This is an emergency situation. I have HOA business to conduct, and if you don't—" I stood up, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You're right," I said, stretching as if I had all the time in the world. "This is an emergency, but not for you. See, Karren, you forgot something very important." She crossed her arms, waiting. "This panel." I gestured to the maintenance box. "It's on my property, and according to county records, I have the final say over any non-essential connections linked to it, including yours." Her face paled. "You're bluffing," she said. I shrugged. "Call an electrician if you don't believe me. But until I get a formal apology and written confirmation that the HOA will never attempt to restrict my property access again, I don't see any reason to reconnect your power." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You can't do this," she finally hissed. "But you can lock me out of my own home?" I arched a brow. Interesting logic. Her fury was almost tangible. She wanted to scream, to threaten, to demand I comply. But she knew she had no ground to stand on. "You'll regret this," she spat before turning on her heel and stomping back to her powerless house. I watched her go, enjoying the rare sight of Karren Stockton losing for once. She had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, using her position to bully people into submission. But today, she had finally met her match. And I wasn't done yet. Karren's furious retreat didn't mark the end of her antics. If anything, it was just the beginning. I knew she wouldn't take this lying down, but I had no intention of giving her the upper hand again. Less than an hour later, a white utility truck rolled into the neighborhood and parked right in front of my driveway. Two men in work uniforms stepped out, one of them carrying a clipboard. I leaned against my porch railing, watching as they approached. The taller of the two cleared his throat before speaking. "Morning, sir. We got a service request to check the electrical panel on your property. HOA business." I took a slow sip from my coffee. "Did Karren send you?" The man hesitated. "We were contacted by the HOA president." "Yes." I glanced over to her house. Sure enough, she was peering through her curtains, watching like a hawk. I turned back to the workers. "Well, here's the thing. That panel is on my land. And unless you've got a court order or a work request with my signature on it, you're not touching a thing." The shorter guy, clearly less comfortable with the situation, looked at his clipboard. "She told us it was a community panel." I pulled out my phone, already prepared. It was years ago. But the property records say otherwise now. I tapped the screen a few times before holding up a digital copy of the deed. "See? Private property. If you so much as open that box without my consent, it's trespassing." The taller man exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed but not willing to argue. "Look, we're just doing our job. If there's a dispute, you'll need to take it up with the HOA." I nodded. "Oh, I will. But in the meantime, you should probably let your boss know that Karren lied to you." The men exchanged uncertain glances before heading back to their truck. As they drove off, I turned just in time to see Karren storming out of her house, her face twisted in frustration. She marched straight to the sidewalk, stopping just short of stepping onto my property. "You had no right to turn them away." I folded my arms. "I had every right. That panel is mine, and you sent workers under false pretenses." "That's fraud, Karren." She huffed, her hands clenching into fists. "You're disrupting HOA operations. This will have consequences." I gave her a cold look. "You mean like the consequences of locking me out of my own home?" "Because I've already filed a police report about that." For the first time, genuine worry flickered in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to escalate things legally. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered. "It was an enforcement action." I shook my head. "Keep telling yourself that. But when the cops come knocking, they're not going to care about your enforcement action. They're going to care about the fact that you illegally tampered with someone else's property." She opened her mouth but closed it again, clearly realizing she had overplayed her hand. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her house. I wasn't done. That night, I drafted a letter to the county zoning board, detailing everything Karren had done. I included the photos of my chained gate, copies of the bogus violation notices, and a formal complaint about her abuse of power. I also sent a separate letter to a local attorney, inquiring about a civil suit for harassment and illegal lockout. The next morning, I woke up to a new surprise. Karren had plastered a giant notice on my front door. "Urgent violation. Unauthorized modification to community infrastructure. Fines imposed until rectified." I laughed. She was getting desperate. I ripped the notice down and walked straight to her house. When she opened the door, I held up the paper. You really think this is going to work? Her expression was smug again, as if she thought she had finally backed me into a corner. You've tampered with HOA property. That's a serious offense. I shook my head, amused at how bold she was despite being in the wrong. You know what's a serious offense? Illegally restricting access to someone's home. I've already spoken to my lawyer. By the end of the week, you'll be facing criminal trespass charges. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. I continued. And since we're talking about legal matters, I also filed a complaint with the zoning board. They're going to love hearing how you've been abusing your position. Her face turned red. You're making a mistake. I grinned. No, Karren, the only mistake here is yours. And it's about to cost you a lot more than just your power. For the first time, she had no response. I turned and walked away, the sound of her door slamming shut behind me. Let her stew. This was far from over. The fallout from my zoning complaint and legal threats didn't take long to shake the neighborhood. The next morning, a black sedan with government plates rolled up to Karren's house. I watched from my porch as a man in a navy suit stepped out, adjusting his tie before knocking on her door. She answered quickly, her stance stiff as she spoke to him. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't working. He cut her off multiple times, gesturing toward my property and the electrical panel. She kept shaking her head, but he remained firm. After a few minutes, he handed her a folder and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, gripping the papers so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't have to guess what was in that folder. The zoning board had apparently moved fast. Karren stormed back inside, slamming the door behind her. Later that afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. He had good news: the police were officially investigating Karren for unlawful lockout and trespassing. If she thought she could bully her way out of this, she was sorely mistaken. It only got worse for her from there. 2 days later, I spotted a city inspector knocking on her door. He was carrying a clipboard and a measuring tape, looking like he meant business. Karren answered, clearly trying to put on a pleasant front, but it was obvious from her rigid posture that she was panicking. The inspector wasted no time. He pointed at her property, then at mine, asking pointed questions while jotting down notes. Karren's expression shifted rapidly, first confusion, then frustration, then barely contained rage. The moment he left, she stomped straight across the street to my house, her face flushed. You think you're so clever, she hissed, barely keeping her voice down. You're destroying this community with your nonsense. I leaned against my doorframe, unfazed. I'm just making sure the rules apply to everyone, not just the people you feel like harassing. Her eyes narrowed. You're going to regret this. The HOA board won't stand for it. I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. Funny thing about that, I've had 4 homeowners approach me today alone, thanking me for standing up to you. Seems like the board isn't as loyal to you as you think. The color drained from her face for just a second before she recovered. You think you can turn people against me? I shrugged. I don't have to. You're doing a fine job of that yourself. She opened her mouth to retort but hesitated. It was clear she was losing ground fast. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house. The next morning, the real blow came. A special HOA meeting had been scheduled, emergency session. Word spread fast, and by the time I arrived at the clubhouse, the place was packed. Homeowners who normally avoided these meetings had shown up, curious to see what was going on. Karren sat at the front, flanked by the other board members. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. The moment the meeting started, a man in a brown blazer stood up. I have a motion to bring to the floor. Karren plastered on a fake smile. All motions need to be submitted in writing before. He cut her off. I moved to remove Karren Stockton as HOA president, effective immediately. The room broke into murmurs. Karren's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her shock. This is absurd, she scoffed. I have done nothing but uphold the integrity of this community. Another homeowner stood up. You chained someone's gate shut, without due process. Karren's face twitched. That was an enforcement action. A woman near the back called out. And what about the illegal fines? The fabricated violations? Another voice joined in. The way you target people you don't like? Karren's mask was slipping. I have done no such thing. The man in the blazer raised a hand. We have documentation. And I checked with the county. Your authority doesn't extend to half the things you claim it does. Karren's composure cracked. You're all being manipulated by, she pointed directly at me, him. I raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting her dig her own grave. The man leading the charge sighed. A vote has been called. All in favor of removing Karren Stockton from her position. Hands shot up across the room. Karren scanned the crowd, her panic barely concealed now. The final count was overwhelming. It's decided, the man announced. Effective immediately, Karren Stockton is no longer HOA president. For the first time since this started, Karren looked truly lost. She shot up from her seat, glaring at the crowd. You'll regret this. None of you understand how much I've done for this community. No one responded. She turned toward me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This isn't over. I gave her a small, knowing smile. For you? Oh, it absolutely is. She stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. The tension in the room lifted almost immediately. Conversations broke out, people shaking hands, some even laughing in relief. The man in the blazer approached me. I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you. I shook his hand, just doing what needed to be done. And with that, the reign of Karren Stockton was officially over. With Karren stripped of her title, I figured she'd retreat into bitter obscurity, but I underestimated just how deep her sense of entitlement ran. The very next morning, I caught her standing outside my property, arms crossed, glaring at the electrical panel like she was trying to will it back under her control. Her hair was a mess, and she wore the same clothes from the night before, a sure sign that she hadn't slept or that she had spent the entire night scheming. I took my time stepping off the porch, making sure she saw me approach. If she was stupid enough to try something again, I wanted to catch her in the act. Something on your mind? I asked, keeping my voice even. She turned, schooling her expression into something she probably thought was dignified. You have no idea what kind of mess you've caused. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Enlighten me. Her lip curled. The HOA is in chaos. The board is fractured. There's no leadership, no structure. Homeowners are already ignoring regulations, trash bins left out, mismatched fences being discussed. This community is falling apart because of you. I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. Or maybe it's falling apart because you ran it like a dictatorship, and now no one wants to clean up your mess. She inhaled sharply, regaining her composure. You need to reinstate me. This isn't about you and me anymore, it's about the integrity of this neighborhood. I barked out a laugh. I don't have the power to reinstate you. And even if I did, why would I? You locked me out of my own house, tried to fine me into submission, and then sent workers to trespass on my property. You're lucky I haven't pressed full charges yet. Her eye twitched. Yet, I shrugged, still weighing my options. She squared her shoulders, her voice turning icy. You think you're in control, but you're not. The board may have turned on me, but I still have influence. Don't be surprised if certain policies start working against you very soon. I narrowed my eyes. That sounded like a threat. It's a promise, she said, turning on her heel and stomping away. I watched her retreat, shaking my head. She had lost, but she refused to accept it. That evening, I decided to pay a visit to one of the board members, Alan, a retired contractor who had always seemed level-headed. I knocked on his door, and when he answered, he looked at me with an expression halfway between relief and exhaustion. Let me guess, he said. You're here about Karren. I nodded. She's not letting this go. She was outside my house this morning, ranting about how the community is falling apart and how she's going to make my life miserable. Alan sighed, rubbing his forehead. She's been calling board members nonstop, trying to rally support for some kind of reinstatement. Even after being voted out, she still thinks she runs this place. Any chance she actually succeeds? I asked. He shook his head. Not a chance. Too many people saw what she did. But that doesn't mean she won't try to make things difficult in other ways. Like what? He grimaced. We still have bylaws that technically allow former board members to suggest new policies. They don't have voting power, but if she finds a sympathetic ear, she could push for new restrictions or fines targeting specific homeowners, namely you. I exhaled slowly, considering my next move. Then I need to make sure she doesn't have any influence left. Alan studied me for a moment before nodding. You have something in mind? I grinned. Oh, I do. And I might need your help. The next morning, I did something I knew would get under Karren's skin. I called for a full audit of the HOA's finances. Alan and a few other board members were more than happy to approve it, citing years of questionable expenditures under Karren's leadership. Within hours, an independent accountant was digging through records, looking for inconsistencies. It didn't take long for the first red flag to appear. She's been using HOA funds for personal expenses, Alan told me that evening, his voice laced with both amusement and disgust. Over the past 3 years, she's filed reimbursements for everything from catered dinners to premium landscaping, none of which were approved by the board. I let out a low whistle. So she's been lining her pockets this whole time. Looks that way, Alan confirmed. And once we finish combing through everything, she's going to have a lot to answer for. I wasn't about to wait for the board to handle it quietly. The next day, I printed out copies of the most damning financial records and anonymously slid them under doors throughout the neighborhood. By that afternoon, the entire community was buzzing. Karren must have realized something was wrong because she showed up at my house again, this time looking less angry and more desperate. "You need to stop this," she said the moment I opened the door. I leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Stop what?" "You know what. The audit, the rumors, the smear campaign. This isn't about HOA policies anymore, you're just trying to ruin me." I gave her a long, hard look. "You ruined yourself, Karren. I just shined a light on it." Her hands clenched into fists. "I made this community what it is. I gave it structure, order. And now you're tearing it all down out of spite." I shook my head. "No, I'm getting rid of the corruption. If you actually cared about this community, you wouldn't have stolen from it." She scoffed. "I didn't steal. Those were necessary expenses." I held up one of the papers I had printed. "A $2,000 dinner at a steakhouse. Necessary for what exactly?" Her face turned red. "I was entertaining potential investors for neighborhood improvements." I raised an eyebrow. "Name one improvement that came from those investors." She opened her mouth, then shut it. I smirked. "That's what I thought." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "If you stop this now, I can make it worth your while." I tilted my head. "Are you trying to bribe me?" She forced a tight smile. "Let's call it a mutual agreement. You drop this, and I make sure the HOA doesn't come after you for anything. No fines, no new restrictions, nothing." I chuckled. "You still think you have power here? That's adorable." Her face twisted in frustration. "You don't know what you're doing. Once this gets out, I could lose everything." I met her gaze evenly. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you abused your position." She stared at me for a long moment, her breathing uneven. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. By the end of the week, the board had enough evidence to formally press charges against Karren for embezzlement. The last time I saw her, she was being escorted out of her house by 2 uniformed officers, her face pale and her hands cuffed behind her back. As she was loaded into the squad car, she turned to look at me one last time, her eyes filled with unspoken fury. I simply gave her a small nod and watched as she was driven away. And just like that, Karren Stockton was finally gone. With Karren gone, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, almost. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to step outside without scrutinizing every detail of their homes. Some even started chatting on the sidewalks again, no longer worried about her lurking presence, ready to pounce with another citation. The HOA board held an emergency session to elect a new president, and Alan was the clear choice. Unlike Karren, he actually cared about the community instead of using it as his personal kingdom. His first order of business was a full review of the HOA's policies, stripping out the unnecessary, oppressive rules Karren had implemented to maintain control. As days passed, I noticed something interesting. More neighbors were stopping by to introduce themselves, people who had lived here for years but had been too afraid to interact before. Some came just to shake my hand, thanking me for standing up to Karren. Others, like Mrs. Patel from 2 houses down, brought baked goods as a token of appreciation. One evening, Alan dropped by with a thick folder under his arm. He looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, but there was still a weight in his eyes. He sat down on my porch, setting the folder on the table between us. "We finished digging through the HOA's financials," he said, tapping the cover. "It's worse than we thought." I leaned back in my chair, waiting. "Karren wasn't just skimming funds for personal expenses," he continued. "She was also funneling money into a separate account, one that wasn't listed in the official HOA records. Near as we can tell, she was stockpiling it as a personal slush fund." I frowned. "How much are we talking?" "Over 70 grand. That number hit hard. I had expected her to be corrupt, but that was blatant theft." Alan sighed. "We turned everything over to the authorities. The district attorney's office is looking into felony charges." I exhaled, shaking my head. She really thought she could get away with all of this. "She almost did," Alan admitted. If you hadn't pushed back, she would have kept going. Who knows how much she would have taken? The thought made my stomach turn. Alan flipped open the folder, pulling out a few sheets. I also found something else. A list of properties she had been targeting for special enforcement. I took the papers from him, scanning the names. Mine was at the top, of course. But as I went down the list, I recognized others people who had frequently received bogus fines and complaints. She was deliberately going after certain homeowners, I said. Alan nodded. Anyone who questioned her. Anyone she didn't like. She used the HOA as a weapon. He rubbed his chin. We're working on rescinding all fines issued under her leadership. Some people got hit hard financially because of her nonsense. I appreciated that. A lot of families had been struggling under Karren's rule, paying fines just to avoid her wrath. Alan closed the folder. With her out of the picture, we can rebuild this place into an actual community again. That was something I could get behind. The weeks passed, and the neighborhood continued to settle into its new normal. The HOA board was more transparent now, holding open forums where homeowners could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. People started personalizing their homes again, painting doors new colors, planting flowers, putting up decorations. But Karren wasn't done causing problems. One afternoon, I was outside fixing my fence when a black car rolled up to the curb. I recognized the driver instantly. Karren. She stepped out, looking nothing like the confident, untouchable tyrant she had once been. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and she carried an air of simmering resentment. She walked up to the sidewalk, stopping just short of stepping onto my property. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice cold. I set my tools down and met her gaze. I am, actually. The neighborhood's better off without you. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You ruined me. I crossed my arms. You ruined yourself. I just made sure people saw the truth. She scoffed. You act like you're some kind of hero, but all you did was tear everything apart. This community needed structure. Structure? I repeated. You mean fear. You didn't build a community, Karren. You built a dictatorship. She looked away, her jaw tightening. I gave this place order. No, you gave yourself power. I took a step closer. And you abused it. That's why you lost. That's why you're standing here now, instead of sitting in the HOA office, barking orders. She exhaled sharply. Do you really think these people are going to run this place properly without me? I nodded. Yeah, I do. Because they actually care about this neighborhood. Her expression hardened. You think this is over? I sighed. Karren, it's already over. You lost. You can't control people anymore. And soon, you're going to be answering for everything you did. She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to find some angle, some last move she could play. But there was nothing left. Finally, she shook her head. You'll regret this. I watched as she turned and walked back to her car, her shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. She drove away without looking back. And just like that, the last remnants of her reign disappeared down the street. The neighborhood continued to thrive without her. The HOA operated fairly now, no longer a tool for personal vendettas. People were happier, free to actually enjoy their homes without fear of unjust fines or harassment. One evening, I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink as I watched kids ride their bikes down the street. Laughter echoed through the air, a sound that had been missing for far too long. Alan walked by, giving me a nod. Feels different, doesn't it? I smiled. Yeah, it does. And for the first time since moving here, I felt at home.